Welcome to episode 12. This is the final episode of the PhD life cycle programme, and I think it's a fitting place to finish. One pattern that still surprises me is how often students think the viva represents the finish line. Very often it does not. There are still corrections, there is still closure, and perhaps more importantly, there is still a transition taking place. This episode is really about understanding what happens after the visible end of the doctorate. And before we begin, let's briefly look back. This slide reminds us of something very important. For many students, the viva feels like the final hurdle. Often it is not. I think this is an important statement, because candidates sometimes imagine an immediate ending. Reality is often more gradual than that, and that naturally brings us to our first myth. This slide introduces a sequence that many people expect. Submit, pass, graduate, move on. Reality is often more complicated. I've lost count of the number of times candidates have described a sense of surprise after the viva. They expected immediate closure. Instead, they discovered another short phase of the journey still remained. And that naturally leads us to understanding outcomes. This slide introduces the possible outcomes. Pass with no corrections, minor corrections, major corrections, resubmission, failure. I want to normalise something immediately. Minor corrections are extremely common. Major corrections are not unusual. These outcomes sit within the normal doctoral landscape. They're not automatically reflections of success or failure. And because minor corrections are so common, they deserve attention. This slide contains a message that I strongly believe in. Minor corrections are extremely common and usually represent final polishing. I've examined many doctoral theses over the years. Very few have emerged without any corrections whatsoever. One thing I wish more students understood is that minor corrections often reflect refinement rather than deficiency. This should feel reassuring. And yet, despite that, many candidates still find this stage emotionally difficult. This slide captures something very human. After years of effort, even small additional tasks can feel overwhelming. I remember one candidate saying, "I know they're only minor corrections, but I just want this to be over." That reaction is perfectly understandable. You've invested years of energy by this point. Even small requests can feel bigger than they actually are. And sometimes the requests are larger, which brings us to major corrections. This slide addresses something that students often fear. Major corrections can feel discouraging, but often indicate the doctorate remains achievable. I deliberately emphasise the second part, because many students hear the word major and immediately assume disaster. That is not always the case. I've seen many candidates successfully navigate major corrections. The key is to remain systematic, which naturally brings us to a recovery plan. This slide introduces 4 excellent principles. Understand the examiner's report, prioritise actions, create a timetable, maintain momentum. One thing I wish more students understood is that correction reports often look more intimidating than they really are. Break them down, deal with one issue at a time. Progress usually becomes much more manageable when large tasks are divided into smaller actions. And sometimes another route still exists: resubmission. This slide introduces a topic that is rarely discussed openly. Many resubmitted theses eventually succeed despite the emotional challenge. I think honesty is important here. Resubmission can feel extremely difficult emotionally, but it should not automatically be interpreted as the end of the journey. One pattern that still surprises me is how resilient people often become during this stage. And that naturally brings us to another reality. Sometimes things do not go to plan. This slide contains an important message. Failure is uncommon, but real, and should be acknowledged honestly. I think it's important that this slide exists, because overly positive narratives can sometimes be unhelpful. Doctoral study is demanding. Occasionally outcomes are disappointing, but outcomes never fully define people. I've become increasingly convinced over the years that people are much more than the doctorate itself. And this leads us to another hidden reality. Completion often takes longer than expected. This slide captures something almost everybody experiences. Completion often takes longer than candidates anticipate. I've lost count of the number of times students imagined the doctorate ending on a specific date. In reality, closure often happens gradually. That is perfectly normal, because doctorates are processes rather than events. And eventually another interesting experience begins to appear. Finishing itself feels strange. I think this may be one of the most important slides in the episode. Completion can feel unexpectedly disorientating after years of focus. One pattern that still surprises me is how many graduates initially feel slightly lost. For years, the doctorate has structured your life. Then suddenly it's over. That adjustment often takes time. And perhaps that is because something much bigger has happened. You've changed. This slide beautifully captures the whole program. The person who finishes is rarely the same person who started. I've seen this happen repeatedly over many years. People become more reflective, more comfortable with uncertainty, more confident in their judgment, sometimes more humble too. The transformation is often gradual and only becomes obvious afterwards. And that naturally leads us to another important question. What has the doctorate really taught you? This slide introduces 4 things that I believe sit at the heart of doctoral education: independent judgment, persistence, humility, resilience. Looking back, I've become less certain that the thesis itself is the most important outcome. I've become more certain that the researcher who emerges may be even more important, because these qualities often remain long after the doctorate ends. And perhaps that is why the reflection questions matter so much. This slide asks the 3 wonderful questions. What have I gained? What has changed in me? What will I carry forward? I would encourage you to spend genuine time with these, because these are not academic questions, they are life questions. And before we finish, there is one final slide that beautifully closes the entire program. I think this may be my favourite slide in the entire program. The journey began with, should I do a PhD? And it ends with, who have I become? I genuinely believe this is what the whole program has been trying to explain. The formal doctorate is visible. The lived doctorate is often invisible. And much of that invisible journey has been about becoming someone new. And before we conclude, let's briefly acknowledge the references. This slide introduces several excellent authors, who've helped doctoral researchers for many years. But I would like to finish with one final thought. After years of supervision, examination and doctoral leadership, I've become less certain that doctorates are simply about producing theses. I've become more certain that they are about producing researchers. Researchers who can think independently, exercise judgment, navigate uncertainty, and contribute something meaningful to the world around them. Thank you for joining me on the PhD life cycle journey.